This is They Create Worlds, episode 228, PopCap Games.
If anybody wants to find me, I'll be in the last place you would look. In a place where people used to be, a land that's called reality. You'll find me there.
Welcome to They Create Worlds. I'm Jeffrey, and I'm joined by my co-host, Alex.
Hello.
We're stuck in here, having to talk about video games as we have the doors barricaded against hordes of rampaging zombies. I ran out of shells. The only thing left I have is plant seeds. Well, somehow they're holding their own.
Indeed, that's right. Today we are coming at you with one of our rare 21st century episodes as we take a look at the iconic casual game company PopCap Games. We don't do 21st century topics very often, not because we don't love them. We're still gamers, we still play games, but it takes a while oftentimes to get the necessary historical perspective to be able to say something other than just giving a really, really basic corporate timeline of releases. We like to try to put things into context. We don't have to have deep inside stories on every company we cover like we do for Atari at this point, but we at least need something more than just, they were founded on this date, and on this date they released that game. We've done Naughty Dog, we've done Mass Effect, we've done some of the roguelikes from the 21st century like Spelunky. We normally avoid this century just for those reasons, but there's been a lot written about the early days of PopCap, a lot of interviews given by the founders. Plus, it's just an interesting story because it really fits within the changing context of what it means to have a small casual game and what platforms you actually use to deliver those games. So, yeah, PopCap.
So as you're sitting back and you enjoy popping open that soda and taking a sip, and you like what we do here at They Create Worlds, you can always help us out by leaving a review on your favorite podcasting service, or perhaps even your least favorite podcasting service. I don't know. There could be a whole bunch of them that you listen to us to or see us on. You can just review us on Spotify, Apple, all of them. I don't care. It makes us happy when you do that. 5 stars, 4 stars. We become less happy with 3 stars, but 2 stars is right out.
And of course, we're also on YouTube these days as well, so you can always like, comment, and subscribe there as well. Audio only. We only do video once a year for you happy people, but all the episodes are available on our YouTube page as well.
You get at least a visualizer with that one. That took a while to figure out. It makes pretty bars to go up and down whenever we talk. As you're staring at us as we're talking to you on YouTube here, it goes up and down and up and down.
Very dramatic.
But that's not what these people are here for. They're here for more important things like some sort of PopCap Games. Where did they come from? Where are they going? And how are they an exemplar of casual gaming in the early 2000s, leading on to now?
Indeed, though we won't really talk much about where they're going. The idea here is to take them up to their purchase by EA. Because by that point, we are getting too recent. There really isn't much insider info and anything to say. So we're really covering just about a dozen years where they were an independent company from 2000 to 2012.
Who founded them? And where in the wide world of crazy did they come from?
Indeed. Well, really, the story of PopCap Games starts with 2 freshmen in college, as it seems like so many of these stories do. It's how the Naughty Dog story kind of sort of works too, who met each other at Purdue University, met in a programming class, discovered they lived in the same dorm, but they didn't meet through their dorm. They met through the class. Each discovered that they had a great love of and desire to create games. The more adept programmer of the two was a gentleman by the name of Brian Feet, that is spelled F-I-E-T-E, not the traditional way, who was from South Carolina and was quite the programming prodigy. He was just really good self-taught programmer. Huge game player, used to hang out in the local Aladdin's Castle all day long in the late 80s, playing Shinobi and all sorts of space shooter games. In his spare time at home, he was also creating his own games for fun, text-based role-playing games, clones of Pac-Man and other simple arcade games. Just loved everything about games, and found when he got to Purdue that he really kind of already knew all the programming that he needed to know. The less accomplished of the two, but no less enthusiastic, was a gentleman by the name of John Vecchi. Vecchi was from Wisconsin, from a lower middle class family. His mother was a bit of a free spirit, remarried often, didn't always have a steady job. One time, she and one of her many spouses even built a cabin in the woods for them to live in because that would be cheaper than going in on the local suburban real estate. Kind of a free spirit, a great lover of games. Even though he was only a middling programmer, he was just ready for life to happen. Like, he was going to college because going to college is the thing that you do, but really, he just wanted to make games. That was his entire goal in life. He thought school was what you had to do on the road to that, but really, he couldn't be bothered if there were a better way. So the two of them bonded immediately. This was in roughly 1997, give or take, and bonded over Feat's already existing plan to create an online game that could be played by people all over the country and the world using a modem. Now, this was pretty heady stuff in 1997.
Oh, yeah, definitely. The internet didn't really become a thing until about 96. That's where it really started hitting the public zeitgeist. Then arguably it really didn't hit its stride until about 2002, 2004.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, people were online basically all through dial-up at this point, and many of those people still stuck even in the old 14.4 days, not even the 28.8. You old-timers know what I'm talking about. You real old-timers are saying, back in my day, we had to put our receiver on an acoustic coupler. Okay, fine. You win. You win the old-timer competition with that one, because I started out after you didn't need an acoustic coupler anymore. But still, we're talking really slow modems, 14.4 baud, 28.8 baud modems, dial-up are what most people are using. So there is some online game activity, and certainly some games have been adapted for play online. Most notably, Quake is already out, which John Carmack built from the ground up to be able to play online multiplayer. But this is really early. It's not just like two guys getting together and making a game. The first thing they're normally going to think of in this time period is, let's make an online game. Like a graphical, real-time online game. You know, there are lots of muds and mucks and moos and mushes out there. But we're talking about a real graphical game here, not something text-based. Very ambitious, but Feat's a great programmer, so he kind of has the chops to do it. What he's not is an artist. He is rubbish at art, and he's looking for an artist to help him make this game. Well, Vecchi is also not an artist, quite frankly. As I said, Vecchi really wants to make games, and he just wants this to start now. He doesn't care about the schooling. He doesn't care about going normal career paths. He just wants to make games. So when Feat says, I need an artist for my game, want to help out? He was like, I'm not a great artist, but sure, I'll give it a shot. So he drew some flying saucers that Feat promptly compared to nipples. Great job there, Vecchi. Just because the way they looked. But they were off to the races. So they created this game together that was called ARC, which was an acronym or initialism for Attack, Retrieve, Capture. This was, as the other co-founder of PopCap, who we'll get to in a moment, Jason Kapalka likes to say, was like a 2D version of Counter-Strike before Counter-Strike. It's not nearly as sophisticated as Counter-Strike. I mean, not just the fact that it's 2D versus 3D graphics. But it's a similar idea in that it was a team-based shooter. You have these two teams of people in their flying saucers, overhead view, navigating this arena. The main gameplay mode was a capture the flag. So you're navigating around, shooting the other side, and trying to capture their flag and bring it back to their base. It's a team-based shooter, online multiplayer, pre-Counter-Strike, though obviously not 3D, not all of the exacting weapon specifications and all the other cool stuff that makes Counter-Strike. But still, again, pretty decently ahead of its time, because obviously you had deathmatch games. You had Doom, you had Quake, you had all the games that followed in their wake, but team-based shooters were not particularly common at this time. That's pretty cool and kind of speaks to Feat's real vision for what could potentially be done over the internet.
Certainly ambitious. I got a bit of video for it. It's a top-down shooter, like you said. It's slow. The frame rate is pretty slow, but you have to be when you're trying to do a multiplayer game on a slow modem. You have to be able to accommodate that stuff. We didn't have the client-server model that we have today, where a lot of these questions of how do I handle multiplayer games when we have multiple inputs going back to a central server? How do I know whether or not you shoot, it hits? Do I register that on the client side, or do I register that on the server side? There's a bunch of things that can play into that cause a bunch of issues if you don't design the underlying framework well.
Absolutely. So they complete that and get it out there into the world. Wikipedia says it was completed in 1995. Other sources that I've seen talk about them working on it in 1997. So I think it's possible they may have started working on it a little earlier, but I don't think it was playable by anyone until 1997. All of this was just very early in the process and very impressive. They initially hosted it at a place called ulink.net, which was an ISP based out of Sacramento, California. In the early days of the internet here, there were a lot of these small ISPs before all the media companies took things over. Eventually, it came to the attention of one of the early online game portals, 10, the Total Entertainment Network. We need to take a step back for a second here and kind of talk about what it meant to have online gaming in the late 1990s. This is a period of time, as we said, when the internet was just starting up and the World Wide Web was just rising to prominence. One of the real big questions about the internet from corporate America and about the World Wide Web from corporate America is, how the heck do you profit off of this thing? Which, of course, is a question that makes a lot of internet people cringe just to hear, because they would tell you, you're not supposed to, you dummy.
The internet is free.
The World Wide Web was created in a way that was very open, was very free, was very unregulated, and was very accessible to all. It wasn't developed as a commercial project. It wasn't developed specifically for monetization. However, it was clear to anyone who had those kind of aspirations that there were soon going to be a lot of people interacting in this new virtual space. So we need to find ways to connect with them, and quite frankly, we need to find ways to make a buck off of them. I'm not saying that's the inevitable way the world works. I'm just saying that's how a lot of entrepreneurs were thinking in the late 1990s during the period that would become known as the dot-com bubble. So games were obviously a big part of this. Online gaming in this context could mean two very different things. It could mean games specifically created to be consumed online. Now, these games of this type, by nature, were going to have to be very simple, because people are on dial-up. People cannot run their phone line all day long and tie their phone line up all day long. Some people are still paying some kind of per-minute charge to even access the internet. That's starting to go away, particularly in the United States, but far less so in the rest of the world.
Just think about that, kids. Paying per minute for any kind of phone call we are so used to these days with our cell phone for unlimited text and minutes.
Yeah.
The reason they say unlimited is because it used to be the case where they would charge you per minute for a phone call. It would build like a utility that you consumed time on, like water or electricity.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to call Alex down the street. I would call. There was a basic charge for having the phone line in the first place, and then they would charge for each minute Alex and I talked on the phone.
Absolutely. In the United States, by this time, local calls pretty much didn't work like that anymore. long distance still did in some situations. In the rest of the world, or at least in Europe, it was still very much a kind of by-the-minute system. It's not like you were going to be spending, or most people were going to be spending hundreds of hours online. They had to be games that were kind of short. They had to be kind of simple as well, because you had to be able to interact in this dial-up environment with 14.4 and 28.8 baud modems and very low upload and download speeds. You needed something that was going to be universally compatible, which meant that at this period of time, you were looking at most of these kinds of games online being programmed in Java, because we're even a little before the Adobe Flash days.
Oh, God, not Java. Please, for the love of... No, not Java.
Since we have already hit your PTSD, so can't do any further harm, tell the good people a little bit about the Java programming language, Jeffrey.
Java is an interesting thing. It's still used today in a lot of applications. Its biggest claim to fame is that you have a runtime environment, almost like a virtual machine.
Mm-hmm.
So that means that any code that you write is very portable. Someone installs the Java runtime environment on their particular system, Windows, Mac, Linux, whatever, then they can run your application whole cloth. It has a lot of memory collection things that worked questionably well. What I mean by that is I want to have a variable that stores data, and it has to request that variable space in RAM from the computer, and then it didn't always nicely release it. It's supposed to with its garbage collection, but, at least in my experience, it never seemed to work quite as intended.
Indeed. Java never working quite as intended is, kind of the big knock against it. It was so portable and so universal. Web browsers could put Java extensions directly into the web browsers, and so you could interact directly on web pages and all of that good stuff. Even though it was essentially a virtual machine, there were still slight differences to every target platform. It's inevitable. You didn't have to recompile. That was the good thing about the way it worked. You didn't have to compile Java for every single environment you wanted to run it in. But there would still be little quirks. Sun Microsystems, which developed Java and released it commercially in 1995, liked to use the slogan, write once, run anywhere, for the program. But the joke amongst developers, because of that finickiness on target platforms, was that the real slogan should be, write once, debug everywhere.
Yeah, there were a lot of issues just running with Java. You have some of that in the modern context. Look at Minecraft. Minecraft was originally written in Java. And if you've ever tried to run a Minecraft server, I know we have joined it as far as friends a few times.
Mm-hmm.
Our friend Joe's helped me with some stuff on the podcast. He and I were going back and forth trying to figure out, okay, what are the magical Java flags we need to add to this thing so that it does memory collection fast enough, it allocates enough memory so that this thing responds properly. How do we put all these weird flags onto the Java runtime thing so that the Minecraft server was happy? It's insane if you don't put all these flags on, and yet things, at least back in the time when we were early 2000s when we were doing this, you tell Minecraft to run, and it goes, sure, I'll run. I'll just do so poorly because I don't have all these flags.
Indeed. So that was one common path for online gaming at this time, which lended itself to primarily shorter and simpler kinds of games. The other was actually playing the games you know and love from the major publishers online. Playing Doom or Quake over the internet, or any of the other AAA titles that were coming out of the mainstream video game industry. The publishers themselves generally ignored this market in the early days, including id. Doom was not internet ready out of the box. Quake was, but not Doom. Because it was a small market. It's a market they didn't know what it was going to look like. It would have taken a lot of effort a lot of man hours to get code optimized to be able to run these games over the internet. It's a big deal even today, and even a more of a deal back in these days when everything is unreliable and slow and everything. Latency is real, people, and it's a problem in multiplayer gaming. It's a tangent, but one of the stories I love is Warcraft, when they were working on the multiplayer at Blizzard. The first time, according to Patrick Wyatt, they ever played a multiplayer game of Warcraft. It was Patrick Wyatt and another player, and each of them, when the game crashed, was convinced that they were totally destroying their opponent, because on their own system, that's what it looked like, because the latency had gotten so bad, they were completely out of sync, and the game had no real idea what was going on between the two of them.
We're just continuing along. We'll figure out reality later.
Indeed. A lot of the publishers weren't dealing with this themselves in the beginning. So they were actually farming this out. At first, there were, just kind of hacker indie projects, like Dwango for Doom or Kali, which you could use in Doom and Warcraft 2 and whatnot. But then as it was starting to get a little more commercialized, when people were seeing this potential, but before all of the publishers were necessarily wanting to jump into this, there started to be middlemen that would do this instead. They would license the games from the publishers. They would take care of creating the online code. They would host the servers. They would do the matchmaking. They would run everything through their service. And that's how people could play each other over the internet. So these are kind of the two areas that online portals are getting into. And not all online portals are doing both. Some are doing one, some are doing the other, some are doing both. Online portals become a way to try to attract people to your full range of services. So there were some bespoke companies that were set up specifically to be online portals, and we're going to talk about one of those very shortly because it's important to the PopCap story. But you also had companies like Excite, Lycos, Yahoo, Real Networks. All of these things that our younger listeners, if we have any of them, are like, what are those things? The 90s internet.
So much crazy.
As well as big companies like Sony and Microsoft would set up these online portals and put games on them as a way to draw people to their sites, draw people to the other content that they also made available. This entire space was powered by ad sales and by advertising. But not in the way the internet is powered by advertising today, where Google and other companies have all of these analytics that is ruining life everywhere, that tries to target you with specific ads and all of this stuff. It was far more primitive back then. There would be ad banners on these sites, similar to the way many sites still have ad banners today. But they would not be targeted in any way. There were no analytics behind this. They would just make deals with companies that would buy banner space, and then these banners would rotate throughout your time on the site, and the hope was that you would click on one, and then that would generate advertising revenues. Somewhat similar to the way a lot of the internet is still monetized today, but just far more primitive. So that was the model. For the most part, the games themselves were free, and they tried to make their money on these ad sales, which again was a barrier to doing anything sophisticated on the internet, because everyone knew you weren't going to get a lot of ad sales out of this. I mean, you were going to get a little revenue, but you weren't going to get a lot. You couldn't fund development of really big, complex, interesting games on this model. Now, obviously, the MMO industry is starting up at the same time, and they're doing their thing with monthly subscriptions. But we're talking about, the majority of these small online games. Most companies did not want to put up with all of the infrastructure that would be required to run an MMO. That's a big commitment. So when you're talking about games, you're talking about games that were not perceived as valuable because you couldn't put a lot of development effort into them, because you weren't going to recoup those development costs. EA tried to create a true AAA online gaming experience with their EA.com. It was an unmitigated disaster. They lost tens of millions of dollars because they were doing all of this more serious development. So they were sinking a lot of development cost in, but not getting the revenue in return. They tried, to get people there for free, and then they tried to convert them into premium users, subscribers, and that just didn't work. This is all just to say there's a lot of confusion in this space at this time. It's not really a space where anyone has figured out how to do anything profitably. But everyone's excited about it because this is the .com bubble. Everyone's heard about this amazing new thing called the World Wide Web, and they want to be a part of it. So that's the confusing kind of market and atmosphere that Arc launched into. After being online for a little bit, it caught the attention of one of these online gaming portals, as I said earlier, the Total Entertainment Network, or TEN. TEN had been established in 1995, and the goal of the company at its onset was actually to be kind of like an AOL for teenage kind of gamer types, which is why it was called Total Entertainment Network. So AOL, before the internet, and even after the internet began and they became an ISP, they had a lot of bespoke content. They created a walled garden with material for their subscribers to peruse. And this was completely separate. No one else on the internet could access it. Obviously, it predated the internet. But even after they became an ISP and provided internet access, they still had their AOL areas of content that were just for their subscribers. It was, a wide variety of things. Total Entertainment Network wanted to take that walled garden approach, but essentially try to become like the MTV of the internet age. Something that was kind of hip and edgy and for teenagers. So their initial plan had been to have articles and music and videos and webcomics and all of this crazy stuff going on, as well as games. That didn't work out. Nobody wanted that. But the game part of it stuck. And initially, the gaming part of it was they were doing this licensing of existing AAA titles and taking on the online play aspect of them. Their big deal was with GT Interactive for Duke Nukem 3D. So they were running the online multiplayer for Duke Nukem 3D. They were slowly shifting their model away from that because the publishers were starting to take more and more control of that themselves. So it didn't look like there was going to be any long-term viability. So they were shifting more and more into these quick, easy, simple little puzzle games, things that we would call casual games today, though that market didn't exist in that day. They didn't understand it in that way at that time, but stuff that we would call casual games today. So we're starting to create and acquire that type of content instead. So this game Arc came to their attention. They asked one of their producers to meet with these kids about hosting it on the Total Entertainment Network. That is our third co-founder of PopCap Games, Jason Kapalka. Jason Kapalka is a Canadian and wasn't particularly old at this time either, though he was older than our friends here. He was in his late 20s at the time, approaching 30. He was a writer, and he had been writing reviews for Computer Gaming World. He had an Apple II back in the day. He had dabbled in a little programming. He was interested in this kind of thing. He had been doing writing for Computer Gaming World, doing reviews and such. When his editor there said, hey, I'm going to this new place called Total Entertainment Network, he said, you should come with me. And so Jason was like, okay. So he thought he was going there to be a writer because TEN was going to be doing that written content. They quickly dropped that, and instead he became a producer. It was in that context, when he was looking for games for the Total Entertainment Network, that he stumbled across Veshy and Feet doing their thing with Arc. So he reaches out to them and says, hey, your game's cool, let's do something. They fly out to California, they talk. As he said, he wasn't, as Polka likes to say, he wasn't expecting a couple of 18-year-olds. His usual business negotiating strategy for this stuff was to go out and, have drinks with everybody. And, these kids couldn't drink.
18-year-old can't drink for some reason.
But they still bonded over their love of games. They still found common ground. The boys agreed to allow Arc to be hosted on the Total Entertainment Network. This was around 1998, give or take. So that was their first encounter. At that time, it was nothing more than that one business transaction. Veshy and Feet, after that, they decide to drop out of school. They drop out of Purdue. They get a job with Sierra Entertainment up in Seattle, because Sierra's in Seattle by this time. They move there. We have episodes that talk about that. We have Sierra episodes. Joined a division of theirs called WON, W-O-N, which stood for World Opponent Network. So this was Sierra Entertainment's attempt to get their games into the online space. They had earlier had their bespoke network, the Sierra Network or the Imagination Network. That's not what this is. This is really primarily focused on creating and running online multiplayer for Sierra's own games at the time is what they were primarily doing. So they go up there, they get that job. Flash forward to 99, late 99, early 2000. All three of our co-founders are very unhappy. When it comes to Kapalka, Total Entertainment Network over the last couple of years has been moving more and more into this casual game space, even though they don't call it that yet, into these quick, simple puzzle kind of games that really didn't necessarily interest him to keep working with. They were just trying to get as many little things as they could as possible to put up on their network, which would soon be renamed Pogo.com to underscore their changing business model. Meanwhile, Veshy and Feet didn't feel that one was very ambitious. Like, they were mostly just creating multiplayer code for their games and calling it a day. In fact, when Feet tried to do more than that, he very nearly got fired. Because, he was still this big proponent of these internet games, of these kind of internet-only games like Ark. So he and a fellow programmer at one, Brian Rothstein, who would also end up coming to PopCap down the line, decided that they would make their own word-based puzzle game called Wordax about choosing letter tiles and forming words. And, there are tons of games like that out there these days. They decided that they should do that instead of working on the project that they were actually supposed to be working on, which in corporate America is generally a pretty big no-no. They made this game, they put it out on One. Management was furious, but the game ended up being by far the most popular game on One. So that's probably the only reason that they avoided getting fired, but everyone was absolutely furious at them. So Feet was kind of like, this is lame. They are not doing the right things on the internet. I don't want to do this anymore. So Kapalka, Veshy, and Feet had all kind of kept in touch with each other over the last couple of years. They just basically were all like, we're all unhappy. Let's go found our own online game company together. So that's what they did. And in 2000, they formed the company Sexy Action Cool. That's right. The original corporate name of PopCap Games was Sexy Action Cool.
If we're going to just advertise and hit all of the buttons for teenagers, things need to be sexy, we need to have a lot of action, and of course, because this is the 2000s and 90s, everything must be cool.
Yeah, though, they really didn't put that kind of thought into this name. They needed something where the domain was available. The really only overriding goal was to get something where they could have the URL. Kapalka, in the basement of this place that he had been living, there had been this movie poster for the Antonio Banderas vehicle Desperado, 1995 film, that on the movie poster had the tagline, Sexy Action Cool. They just thought that was hilarious. It kind of became an inside joke amongst the three of them. So when it came time to found a company and have a company name, they just decided, hey, let's just call it Sexy Action Cool, because that's hilarious. That's about the amount of thought they put into it. As Kapalka has said in talks since then, it did cause some problems for him from time to time because he is Canadian. He was in the United States on a work visa. Of course, he would go back to Canada from time to time for whatever. So, when he shows up at the border with his visa, that says that he works at a company called Sexy Action Cool, as he put it, he would sometimes get a little extra scrutiny from the border guards for that one, because that didn't sound legitimate.
Yeah, what kind of company would name themselves like that and not be laundering money or something?
Exactly. Just a little funny aside there. They decided to start this company, Sexy Action Cool. They're starting the company in the year 2000. Some of you might know that 2000 is the year that this lovely little thing we like to call the dot-com bubble burst.
Not the Y2K bug?
No. So, perfect time to found an online gaming company right when the entire dot-com bubble has burst. Everyone is losing their shirt on internet companies, and nobody wants to fund anything like that ever again. Great timing, guys.
Who needs internet? We don't need internet.
These were not business people. None of the three were business people. As they've said, particularly Kopalka in interviews, none of what they were doing was driven by any kind of business plan or business clue or business sense. They just wanted to do the kind of things that they wanted to do. Jason Kopalka was a very creative guy. He had been a writer, so that stands to reason. So he was kind of the creative force. He didn't come up with all the game ideas himself, but he was very involved in game design and creative endeavors. Feet was a wonderful programmer, so he was really their principal programmer, and Veshy was kind of just a jack of all trades, filling in kind of wherever they needed him. They didn't have any funding to start with. There's no venture funding. Nobody was funding .com companies, and even if they were, I'm not sure the three of them would have even sought venture funding. They had no real business people around them. So they needed to raise some money fast to get this company going. So they decided, and this is completely independently from the name of the company. Like, they've claimed this is complete coincidence, and I believe it, because it's like, what the Joker says to Two-Face in The Dark Knight that I like, quoting sometimes. It's like, do I look like a guy who has a plan? It's like, these guys are not guys who have a plan.
They are only concerned about sexy action and coolness.
So they decided that their first product should be a strip poker game.
They're staying on brand with that one.
Yeah, but like I said, they weren't. The point is, these were completely independent decisions that had nothing to do with each other. And I believe them when they say that, because A, why lie? And B, everything about the founding of the company shows that they weren't planning anything in advance. They were just kind of doing. Their logic here was, of course, obviously, there were a lot of pornographic internet sites. As we all know, the internet is really rather great.
For porn.
Bonus points if you get that one.
These internet porn companies aren't necessarily companies that are particularly tech savvy. So they have some other things sometimes going on in addition to the porn, like risque games and that kind of thing. But they're not really well-made games. They figure, Feet's a really good programmer. We could create a really great strip poker engine, then sell that to internet porn websites, because their plan was not to create their own online portal. They don't have that kind of funding or infrastructure. Their idea is, we are going to create games, and then we are going to sell or license those games to existing internet sites to put on their portals. They're like, we'll build this really solid 2D strip poker game engine, and then we'll sell that to internet porn sites who probably are not getting the best stuff from wherever they're getting that kind of thing, and will be wanting to do business with us. However, they were all so uncomfortable at the idea of actually doing real strip poker that they chickened out on their game, which was called Foxy Poker. They chickened out by not having anything important showing. It'd be one of these things where there'd always be an object in the way that was actually blocking the breasts or other sensitive areas. As Kopalka himself has said in talks, it's like, it was a really solid poker game. Like, the poker game was really solid because these people are good. They know what they're doing. But it was like a PG strip poker game. And of course, it's not real pictures because this is the internet circa 1997. We can't wait 20 minutes for each one of those to load. It's cartoony art, and it's not even entirely stripped. Foxy Poker, not exactly the most auspicious start, but good job trying, guys. After their Foxy Poker adventure, they start turning their attention to their first real product. That, of course, is the game that will become known the world over as the still international phenomenon, Bejeweled. The origins of Bejeweled are often very confused. Everyone wants to say that Bejeweled was stolen from this game or that game, ripped off from this source or that source, and there are a million different theories about where they ripped it off. What is true about Bejeweled is that it is a match 3 puzzle game, which means that you have rows of objects of different colors, and you have the ability to swap objects next to each other to move them around the grid with the goal of getting 3 in a row of the same color to make them disappear. Basic match 3 puzzle game. The earliest game that we know of that really started this trend, not that there weren't some other games that had elements of that before, like a Dr. Mario or a Columns, where you have match 3, but you don't necessarily have the ability to manipulate on a piece-by-piece level. They're more Tetris-y than they are what we think of Match 3 today. But the game that really started this was a game called Shiriki that was created by a Russian programmer, Eugene Alimtsin, and released in 1994. Just real simple graphics, nothing fancy, a bunch of circles in rows and columns, and you can move them around to match 3 in a row to get the pieces to disappear. The next step in the evolution, if there is an evolution, I have no idea what Shiriki was influenced by, but you have Tetris with the falling lines, then you have games like Columns and Dr. Mario, where you have like the individual elements within the falling lines that you need to match together that are colored. This is just taking that one step further and getting rid of the falling lines of things altogether and just going to the individual bits and bobs, and that's Shiriki. It's probable that Shiriki is the starting point for what became Bejeweled. However, it did just come out in 1994, and I don't think it was necessarily widely released. The founders say they never saw this game, and I believe them, because they fully admit that they ripped Bejeweled off from something else. Like, they're not claiming that they just came up with Bejeweled all on their own. They fully admit it's a ripoff. So when they say it's not a ripoff of Shiriki, I believe them, because, if you're going to lie, you would just say, yeah, we came up with this all by ourselves and didn't see anything else. However, I think because Shiriki, appealed to people, that there were very quickly clones of Shiriki that started to appear on the internet. What they used as their base was actually a game John Vesci found on the internet by the name of Colors Game, as they all remember it. Don't look for that one, Jeffrey. You're not going to find it.
Aww.
Because Kapulka and the others have tried for years to rediscover that game by going into the Wayback Machine, talking to people and everything. And there is no trace of this game left on the internet. It was an internet game. It was browser-based. It was JavaScript in their recollection, which meant that you literally had to reload the browser page after you made every move to make it update.
Oh, God, that sounds bad.
Yeah, so it was really primitive, but it was similar to Shiriki. It had squares instead of circles, but it was the same idea. You had rows and columns of different colored squares, and you could manipulate individual squares and swap them around to try to line them up and match 3 of the same color. Nobody knows who did Colors Game, or even if that was really the name, or if it wasn't just some giant fever dream. So we don't know exactly where it came from, but likely it was somebody who saw Shiriki and was like, I'm going to make a browser version of Shiriki. But we just don't know that for certain. But they saw no other Match 3 games. They didn't base it on Shiriki. They didn't base it on Columns. They based it on this one game that John Vesci just discovered on the internet. They thought it was a pretty horrible game just in its presentation, but they could see that there might be a good, simple puzzle game idea buried within it. That's what always set PopCap apart throughout the entire period that we're talking about here, is yes, they make simple games. They make these easy little puzzle games. Some of them, a lot of people turn up their noses at and say they're not even games. A lot of that prejudice has gone away in more recent times now that casual games are so prevalent and Match 3 games are so prevalent and Candy Crush has taken over the world and all of that. Some people even turned up their nose at this stuff and said they're not even games. But they weren't just churning out cheap little poorly made things to make a quick buck. That's what has always set PopCap aside from the competition. These were people that were really good at their jobs, really good programmers, really good designers, and they took the time they needed to do a game right and make it really solid and give it a great presentation. Even though the mechanics may be simple, the presentation is always wonderful, which kind of draws you in. And of course, we're going to get to some games that have more complex mechanics as we continue the story too. But even something like Bejeweled, even though it's not the most complex game, which some people would put in quotes, ever made, the presentation is top-notch, and that's what sets PopCap apart. So Brian Feet takes Colors Game and recreates his own version of it, reprograms the whole thing from scratch to create their own Match 3 game. Meanwhile, Kapulka is thinking about how can we make this more visually appealing? I don't just want everything to be the same shape. I want something that makes everything distinct other than just the colors, because that'll just make it more visually interesting and it'll allow a person to more quickly kind of identify what things go together than just having the colors.
Not to mention you could have people who are colorblind.
Absolutely. I honestly don't know how much they were thinking about accessibility back in 2000, just because most companies weren't, sadly, thinking about accessibility in 2000. But that is absolutely another benefit, beyond a shadow of a doubt. He's like, what can I use that both have a lot of colors and have a lot of distinct shapes? So his first thought, probably thinking of slot machines and Pac-Man and all sorts of other things since time immemorial, was fruit. So he tried drawing up some fruit, and he realized once he did it, it's like, okay, well, actually, fruit are not that many different colors. There's like only 3 or 4 colors that most fruits are. And it turns out almost every single fruit is round. So there really aren't that many good shape differentiations between fruit either.
You have to at least cut up that fruit.
Exactly. So his second idea was his much better idea, and that was gemstones. Because there are many different colors of gemstones out there in the world. And of course, you can cut them in many different ways. It's not that a ruby always looks this one shape, but you can cut a gem into this shape, or you can cut a gem into that shape. So you can just have the ruby be this shape, the emerald be that shape, the opal be that shape, whatever. So you can have very distinct shapes and very distinct, believable colors. So they decide to do a jewel-based theme and decide to call this game Diamond Mine. Not Bejeweled, Diamond Mine. They start shopping the game around, and they don't get a lot of takers. Because a lot of companies are really kind of snobby about this. It's like, this is not even a game, really. How is this a game? Because, you know, we do a lot of video game history here. I mean, video games developed out of the arcades and Twitch-based gameplay, or they developed out of D&D with problem solving or turn-based combat mechanics. They're skill-based games. There's always some skill in general in games, even games that don't have a defined endpoint, like SimCity, which doesn't have a defined end objective. There's still a skill in balancing all of the various types of zoning and your infrastructure and all of this stuff. Like, there's still skill, even when it's not objective-based. Diamond Mine, there's no skill involved at all. They do have a time limit in the game in order to try to give a sense of urgency as you play it. Because eventually you'll just run out of moves, even if you don't time it. Like, eventually you just won't have any legal moves left and the game's over. They added a timer to give a sense of urgency to it, but really there's no skill involved. It's a complete random chance kind of game. You either have combinations you can make or you don't. Maybe if your brain works a little faster at pattern recognition than someone else's game, maybe you can do it a fraction of a second faster than they can. But there's not really any skill to that. It's just somebody is able to see it a little faster than somebody else. That is just not what anyone's concept of a game was at that time. I mean, obviously there are games out in the real world that are also like this. There's bingo, there's slot machines, there's lots of games that are just games of chance. Some of these games have even been adapted into video game form. There have been casino games in video game form. There have been slot machines. But that really wasn't anyone's idea of what a game actually is. A game has to test you in some way. It can be an all-ages kind of puzzle game. It can be a Tetris or a Dr. Mario. Those kind of games have come to be accepted within the last decade at the time that this game's coming out. But there's still skill involved in those games. There's still a twitch reaction that you have to make in order to be successful in those games. The idea that you've just got this stuff here and you can put it in any order you want and the only thing constraining you is a time limit. In fact, you might not even be constrained by a time limit because they put in a tutorial mode with no time limit, which is what it turned out once it was released is the only way anyone ever wanted to play it. Nobody wanted the time. And since they put in this mode that had no time, that's what everyone played. So just adding a time limit doesn't really make it a challenging game. And you can even play without the time limit. So what the heck, guys? There was a lot of disdain for this thing. But Microsoft did agree to take it for their MSN Zone. They had just bought an online game portal to make part of MSN and were getting into this online game space. So they said they'd take it. The original business model that Sexy Action Cool, now becoming PopCap, had was that they were going to sell their games to online portals. That's how they were going to make their money. The number varies based on the source and, the memories of people involved. So they asked for like $30,000 to $50,000, somewhere in that range, for Microsoft to buy the game from them. Microsoft said, no. This looks like an okay little time waster. We'll take it from you. It's not worth $30,000 up front or $50,000 up front, whatever the final number was. Because this is just some stupid little time waster with no value that people are going to play for a little bit and throw away and move on to something else in their lives. So what we'll do, though, is we will rent it from you for $1,500 a month to put it up on our site.
$1,500
a month.
But how many months?
Well, but that doesn't matter. They figure either everyone will have forgotten the game before they reach tens of thousands of dollars in rent and they'll stop carrying it, or it'll be popular enough that the ad sales will justify the continuing payment of the rent. That's how much so many of these online games, so many of these casual games were looked down on at the time, is Microsoft, which has a little money. They're not exactly strapped for cash. Microsoft doesn't think this little diamond mine game is worth just paying $30,000 to $50,000 for to own the rights forever and ever and ever. They would rather just lease it for $1,500 a month. But of course, what that means is that PopCap retained full rights to the game.
That is true. So that means that they can take the rights to that game and develop it further into something better.
Oh, and just, use the exact same game in other formats. Again, this was complete luck. They did not see what was about to happen. They would have been perfectly happy to just sell it to Microsoft. It was MSN Zone that said, no, we don't want to buy it. We just want to borrow it. So they took the game, but they did have one request. They did not like the name Diamond Mine. So one of their marketing people came up with the name Bejeweled and told them, we're going to call it Bejeweled. The guys didn't like the name. There had recently been a Brendan Fraser movie called Bedazzled that was really kind of bad. It made them think of that movie. So they really hated the name Bejeweled, but Microsoft was taking the product. Whatever. They licensed Bejeweled to Microsoft, which put it out on their service. I'm not sure if it was late 2000 or early 2001, but somewhere around there.
Ironically enough, I did find Diamond Mine.
Diamond Mine exists, so you can probably find some gameplay of it, because Sexy Action Cool was offering Diamond Mine on their own website, because they had a website too, before they leased it to MSN Zone. It did enter the wild as Diamond Mine, but of course that was quickly forgotten when it became part of MSN Zone and became Bejeweled. Diamond Mine gets a new name, and around this same time, Sexy Action Cool also gets a new name. They're entering a completely different segment of the market where that name is just a little too risque. Now that they're hitting the mainstream with MSN, they decide they need a different name. They didn't put any thought into this either. They put very little thought into this as well. Kapalka liked the idea of the word pop. He thought it was friendly and energetic, just a good-feeling, good-sounding name. So the word pop floated through his brain looking for something to connect to, because pop on its own wasn't a name for a company. They needed more. Basically what they did at that point, because the overriding concern still, since they were an online game company, is can we get the URL? They just started going through a list of words that paired with pop and checking to see if the URL was available, if the domain was available. That was the entire logic. As Kapalka said in interviews, Cap was pretty far down the list. He just uses this as one example. If Pop Frog had been available, the company would have probably been Pop Frog, because that was higher up the list than PopCap. Like, they didn't really care what the second word was. It's just, does it pair with Pop, and is it available? So that's how they came up with PopCap Games. They went down the list until they found a word combination that was not already taken.
Pop Aardvark? No. Pop Baltic? No.
Right.
Pop Dog? No. PopCap! Great!
Until they got to PopCap. These guys are real savvy businessmen through and through.
Honest.
But, of course, the game Bejeweled, once it hits the MSN Zone, ends up being insanely popular. People are loving it. This is what causes PopCap to actually shift its business model entirely, because they realize now we've got a really good game on our hands that people like, and it's a really polished game, and it has unique elements to it. Obviously, match 3 gameplay is all over the internet, but they've tapped into something with their presentation. It has music. They got a musician to do music for it. They have the gyms. It's solidly programmed. Like, they have a real product here. They still control the rights to it, which means that they can sell it in other formats potentially. So they come to Microsoft and say to them, hey, we're thinking of releasing a boxed version. If you let us do that, we'll split the proceeds of the boxed version with you 50-50. Again, there was no science behind why 50-50. They just thought 50 sounded like a good number. So Microsoft was like, nobody's going to buy this thing, but whatever, dude. You do you. They called it Bejeweled Deluxe. It had just a few additional bells and whistles. It was still basically the same game. But they came up with a Bejeweled Deluxe version that they would make available as a standard boxed retail release, because that's still what you did back then in the early 2000s, is you did a boxed retail release. They were not entirely confident in turning this into a full boxed product, just because there was already a version of it available for free online. They were almost approaching this from the point of view of a shareware product where you usually don't charge a lot of money. You might charge a lot of money for a full version, but you give away a lot for free and you're not necessarily asking for a lot of money. Originally, they were thinking that they would sell it for $5. But at the same time, they were working with another company called Astroware to also port the game to other platforms at the time, specifically the Palm digital assistant. Remember Palms?
I do remember Palms. Palm Pilot.
Yep.
And all of its little ways of doing the things.
Right.
My own PDA, personal digital assistant. So much better than, I don't know, Google.
Now, they didn't see these as large markets, these other existing markets at the time, the cell phone market such as it was pre-smartphone, the PDA market. They did not see these as their primary markets, but they figured it doesn't take much effort to hire a company to do a little port for us. We're not going to do these ports in-house, to hire a company to do a port for us, so we might as well get them on some of these other platforms. It's low risk, low reward. So they were working with a company called Astroware on the Palm port of Bejeweled. The guy there, Howard Tomlinson, told them, no, guys, you don't understand. People value a product based on how you value a product. It's not about how much game is in there. If you charge $4 for this, people are going to see that as a $4 product or a $5 product, and they're going to decide that it is cheap and worthless just based on the price. Charge $20 for it. It's still cheaper than a AAA PC game, which is going to be probably somewhere between $40 and $50 at this point in history. It's still cheaper than that, but it doesn't feel cheap the way it would if you charged like $4 or $5 for it. Have respect for your product, and people will respect your product. So that's what they did. They found out that people absolutely wanted this, even though they could play it on the internet. It makes sense because we already talked about all of this. It's still dial-up. You're still tying up your phone line. You're sometimes still paying charges, by the minute charges or by the hour charges, even to get online. There's a real incentive that if you really like this game, you don't necessarily want to keep playing it on the internet. It may be considered a very good investment to just spend $20 and have this game to play forever and ever and ever. The other thing that they didn't count on, if, as I said, you could even call it a game, this game wasn't being played by quote-unquote gamers, by the people that were playing their Sony PlayStations and Sega Dreamcasts and high-end PC games. This was being played by the same people that discovered solitaire. People should have paid attention when all of the moms and grandmas and grandpas in America started playing solitaire when Microsoft made it available with Windows. The people that were playing Bejeweled were the same people playing solitaire. I hate to say it was the moms, because that's not true. That's a bit misogynist. I don't like the term personally, but that's the way the industry at the time referred to it. I am only using the term in that context because, of course, it was not just moms playing it. There were men and women playing it. There were young people and old people playing it. But this was kind of the industry's way of distinguishing at the time. It wasn't the gamers playing it. It was the moms of gamers playing it is kind of the logic behind that. So it's imperfect, but it's the way the industry categorized it at the time. So that's why I use the term in this way here. It was a game that people that didn't normally play games were playing. It was a time waster because sometimes people just want to veg out. Sometimes people just want to sit in front of the television and not think.
Entertain me. I do not want to critically analyze the thing. Just entertain me.
Exactly. All other forms of media had accommodated that kind of desire in books, dime romance novels, television, just very procedural. Everything's resolved at the end of 20 minutes, nothing to worry about. Comedies or 40-minute dramas. Everything else, popcorn flicks that are just dumb action for 90 minutes. Like every other form of media served that kind of customer. Gaming really didn't. Obviously, there were examples, Solitaire, and we did a whole casual games episode, and we talked about some of the early examples of quote-unquote casual games within that episode. It's not like they weren't being served at all, but nobody thought that that was really part of the market for games. They didn't see that part of the market, and they weren't creating for that part of the market. This game reached that part of the market. They weren't looking at a $20 Bejeweled game and then looking at a $40 The Sims and being like, look at all the features The Sims has at $40, and Bejeweled is just pushing gems around. That is not a good value proposition, $40 versus $20. But that's not what they were doing because they didn't play those games. They were just like, $20 is not that much money. I can afford to blow $20 on something. I'm getting hours of mind-numbing fun out of it, so it was worth my $20. Like, I've spent more time doing this than I did, paying, I don't know, movies may have been $7 back then, something like that. They're a lot more now, but, if it costs $7 to go to a movie, 3 movies, and I've spent $20. Well, I've played Bejeweled longer than the amount of time I spent watching 3 movies, so that's a pretty good value. That's how they were thinking of it. They weren't comparing it to a PlayStation game.
Or to put it another way, I can play this game Bejeweled that is simple. I match the colors and the shapes. I get happy dopamine hits as I make all the jewels disappear. Why would I want to play The Sims? I already have enough trouble managing my own life. Why do I need to manage these other things' lives? They're just dying in the sink because they don't know how hygiene works. I can't deal with that.
Yeah.
Oh, look. I make 3 triangles go together and I get a nice bing and I have relaxing music and then I have multiple bings if I set it up nicely. Yay.
Yeah.
I can just sit and mindlessly go bing, bing,
yeah,
bing, super bing.
That's okay. I mean, there are ways that this can be monetized to be harmful. Slot machines are okay in principle as well, but can be horribly weaponized in practice. We're not getting into that aspect of it because PopCap wasn't getting into that aspect of it. They weren't monetizing this. They weren't doing microtransactions, but they did pivot their model. They decided, we're making really slickly presented games. We have talented programmers. We have talented designers. We have talented artists. We are making aesthetically pleasing product that entertains people. We don't need to treat this as disposable in the same way that so many people treat these online games at these portals as disposable. This can be a business, not an exploitative one, because they don't go the microtransaction route, which isn't even a thing in 2001, for the most part. They're not going an exploitative route. They're not getting into loot boxes or microtransactions or any of this ugliness. If we have something that presents this well, let's sell it. Let's do this. So they changed their model in the future so that they would still put games up online, but they would put limited versions up for free online. And then if you wanted the full version of it, you had to buy it. Not subscribe, not microtransaction, just flat out buy it. That's the model that the entire industry shifted to for a short time until everyone discovered microtransactions, and it was a lost cause from there. PopCap was one of the leaders in that. I don't know every player in the field well enough to know to say if they were truly first. It wouldn't surprise me if they weren't truly first, but they were one of the leaders in that shift. So instead of this idea of, oh, we'll just throw all of this stuff up for free and hope that we will recoup our costs either through ad sales or by luring people into subscriptions by giving them the cheap stuff for free. And then if you want more advanced, more sophisticated games, you have to subscribe. They moved the industry away from that model to, we'll put this stuff up online. We'll give you a limited version that you can play for free. But then if you want all of the bells and whistles and features of it, you'll have to pay for it. But just a one time, just pay for the game. So that's the PopCap model going forward over the next few years. They grow steadily but conservatively because these guys, they're not businessmen. They don't actually care. They don't care about the business side at all. I mean, they want to live. They want to have a living. The game's being purchased in the millions, so I mean, they're making money. They're not living in squalor. They're not hippies, but they're not trying to become the biggest and baddest thing ever. They expand over time as it makes sense to expand. It's like, okay, we're working on this game. We need a couple more artists to do this. Let's hire a couple more artists. Or, oh, I guess we have several, more employees than just us now. It's probably time that we get an office in Seattle. So we're going to need to hire an office manager. They add people organically as the company grows, but they're not taking investment. They're not trying to push growth. They're not trying to just grow big fast. They're just growing at the pace of business, essentially. They really are successful in this time period, I think, by they have Bejeweled, which is their bedrock. As it becomes clear as time goes on that Bejeweled is going to be a gift that keeps on giving, I mean, they make other versions of it. They make a Bejeweled 2 and this and that. But the basic Bejeweled franchise, as long as that is going to be a bedrock that keeps them going, they're not under a lot of pressure to constantly churn out games, because the model for a lot of these companies making these simple, casual, online, portal, whatever you want to call them, games, is that since each individual one is so simple, it's not necessarily going to hold interest. So we have to have a constant churn of new product coming out. And of course, if you're constantly churning product, there's only so much quality you can hit. If you have to just keep putting something out every month, every other month, to make sure that you always have something that's new and exciting. Well, with Bejeweled as a base, PopCap doesn't have to do that. So in the beginning, they're pumping out games like every couple of months, but they quickly realize, okay, Bejeweled's doing great. We don't have to do this. Let's take time to do these games properly. Let's take a year. Let's take 2 years. Let's really think through every game to make sure that we have the best gameplay and the best presentation possible. We can do this because Bejeweled is going to bring in the money we need in the meantime. So that's what they do. And, they release a few games that I'm sure people remember, like Zuma, which was a pretty blatant rip-off of the Mitchell arcade game Puzz Pop, which got them into some trouble. They did a game called Alchemy. They did another word game, not surprising since Feet did Word Axe at 1, called Bookworm that people remember somewhat fondly. They had some other games that they did, but Bejeweled was the real bedrock. They were still largely looked down upon by the quote-unquote real game industry at this time, because these games were seen as silly time wasters. They weren't seen as games. They're like, Mom plays that, and they're saying it in a derogatory way. The gaming press ignored them. Hardcore gamers, whatever those are, ignored them. They had a good business, but they just weren't taken seriously within the gaming industry until 2007 and a little game called Peggle. Do you know Peggle? Have you played Peggle?
Yeah, I haven't played Peggle.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting little game. Peggle was the brainchild of a producer and director at PopCap named Sukhbir Sidhu. Sukhbir, back in the late 1990s, had been introduced to pachinko through an imported machine and became very, very addicted by the Japanese game pachinko. He thought it might be really cool to create a pachinko-style video game. But he quickly put that idea aside because it was too luck-based. It was purely luck. And yeah, Bejeweled is purely luck and all of that, but he wasn't looking to do that like specifically a PopCap game. He just thought a pachinko game might be cool. But he didn't like the luck-based aspect, because pachinko is pretty much entirely luck. You launch the balls, and then the balls go where they will, and you don't really even have any control over how you launch them. It's just wherever the physics take them. So he set the idea aside. This was before he was at PopCap. This was after he was exposed in the late 90s. But then when he came to PopCap Games, he saw that our friend Brian Rothstein, who we mentioned earlier, Feet's partner in crime on Word Axe, had created a 2D physics engine for PopCap that would really probably work with a pachinko-style game really well, and so he decided to go back to this idea and try to create this game. At its base level, Peggle involved balls bouncing around the screen off of objects and trying to achieve some kind of objective on the playfield using those balls. I put it in those terms because where Peggle started is very different from where Peggle finished, so I don't want to give the idea that the gameplay at the very beginning was anything like what we got at the end. According to John Vesey, in the gigantic oral history of PopCap Games video on YouTube, which we'll put in the show notes, I actually didn't take a huge amount of information from that video specifically, but it's still a very interesting look at the company and the people behind the company, so we can put that in the show notes. But one thing I did take from that was Vesey's description of Peggle in the beginning. He says in the beginning it was much more like pachinko. The way it works in the finished product, there's just a single ball that bounces around. But originally there were multiple balls flying everywhere, just like there are in the game of pachinko. It was more of a game of achieving goals in sequence than it was just having the ball randomly bounce around the screen. So you'd have to get one of the balls to hit a trigger in this part of the screen, which may open a gate over here, and then you'll have a limited amount of time when that gate's open to get balls into this next area where there's other things to trigger. So it was really complex, and there were a lot of balls flying around the screen, and it just wasn't fun. They were losing the fun element with that. So they were really iterating on the level design. Finally, they developed this one level, I think it was Rothstein that developed it, where there were these huge crosses on the screen. And you had to hit every one of these crosses in the level, which would cause them to disappear. Breakout was another big influence on what they were doing in addition to pachinko. These crosses would disappear when they were hit, and you had to clear all the crosses from the screen. This was getting much closer to something that seemed like a fun gameplay element, but it was still very difficult and not very fun at this point. So they started drilling down from there until they got to the point where they're like, well, instead of these big objects, let's just make it very simple. Let's just have pegs on the screen. The ball knocks around these pegs and has to make all of these pegs disappear. Now they were finally to a point where they felt like they had a fun and rewarding concept. But there was still a problem with it because they were kind of in the breakout mode of we have to clear the screen of everything. The thing that made the game fun and entertaining was the way that the ball was bouncing around all of these different pegs. So when you were down to just 1 or 2 pegs left or something like that on the screen, it was just tedious. They're just losing the fun again. So they finally hit on the final key element that made the game what it was, which is that at the beginning of the round, a random subset of the pegs on the screen change color and are designated as the pegs that you have to knock out in the round. When you clear all of those orange pegs, that's when the round ends. So you're not trying to clear the whole screen, so you keep that frenetic atmosphere of all of the bouncing around throughout the entire thing because you just have to get rid of the orange ones on the screen. This took them about a year to get to this point. They probably could have released the game at that time, more or less, after a little more time for polishing or whatever. But this is PopCap, and one of the things that really sets PopCap apart is their slick presentation. That's what they do. That's why they can sell their games as a more premium experience when other companies consider them cheap disposables. So they took a whole nother year, because they could, because that was the philosophy of the company, because this is several years after Bejeweled. They know that they've got money, and their philosophy is we're going to take as much time as necessary to release a game. We're not going to rush it. We're going to make sure the presentation is as slick as possible, the gameplay is as tight as possible before we put this thing out. They take a year, and they commission a bunch of hand-drawn art. That's where all the unicorns and rainbows and such come in, to create this really vibrant, colorful world. Then they add one other element somewhere in here. I don't know exactly where, but they add one final element to the game that actually comes from the racing game Burnout 3 Takedown. Burnout 3 is part of the classic street racing Burnout franchise. One of the elements that really made that game stand out and is still considered one of the finest games in the series is the takedown mechanic, which is mentioned in the titles itself, where if you run into your opponents often enough, you can destroy their cars and take them down. When you do that, there's this slow-mo moment where the car flies off the road and is destroyed in slow motion when you get a takedown. And it just feels really satisfying to get the takedown. So they added into Peggle what they called Extreme Fever, which is that right before the last orange ball that you need to eliminate is about to disappear, the whole game goes into slow-mo as it approaches that last ball, and then there's this big explosion as Ode to Joy plays as you clear the stage. They call that Extreme Fever. And they took that directly from Burnout 3 Takedown. That's one of the things Veshy says in the Oral History of PopCap documentary on YouTube. You know, I think that just really shows again what this company is all about, because even though they're making these casual games, which are so dismissed by so many people in the industry at this time, they are gamers. They are playing other games, and they understand what makes games fun. It doesn't matter whether that game is a hardcore RPG or a mid-core racing game or a super casual game like Bejeweled. They understand the presentation elements that make a game fun. So they're pulling things from what the industry considers to be legitimate games at the time in order to enhance their product. They really care about the product, and they're not just making these little throwaway things, you know?
That's kind of the problem the industry had around this time, is that it was very dismissive of casual games. Yet casual games brought in a lot of money because it appealed to an underserved demographic of people who just wanted to play games. I need to play games on my commute. I'm waiting for something to get done and I have a spare 20 minutes. They can play and enjoy a game, like they say, time wasters, but that's not a bad thing to waste time. You're doing that to relax. You're doing that to unwind. You're doing that to recenter yourself before you take on whatever other challenge you have during the day.
Absolutely. Peggle releases in 2007. It's doing all right, but this is the first time that they really kind of hope that they can get a more mainstream gaming industry audience to pay attention to this game. Even though there's still a lot of luck involved in the way the ball bounces around, this is a game that actually does have some skill in it. So they work really hard on the gaming magazines. This is another thing from the oral history of PopCap, where, you know, they're calling around and they're like, no, guys, you're the Bejeweled guys. Like, you don't make real games. We're not playing this thing. And, you know, since you sent it to us, we looked at it for about 5 minutes and we're like, this game's purely luck-based and we are not touching this nonsense. So the guy was like, look, guys, I know that after 5 minutes it might feel that way, but you have to play it for at least an hour before you start seeing where the skill breaks through. I promise you, if you play it for an hour, you'll see the merit of this game. I will stake my reputation on that. They got reviewers to play it, and they kind of started to feel a little more favorable about it. But it still had one other problem to it as well, which is that it did have a very specific aesthetic with unicorns and rainbows, which was, let's just say, out of step with the mainstream hardcore gamer aesthetic at the time. The presentation actually proved to be a little bit of a barrier to adoption. But there was one place where everybody fell in love with the game. That was a little company called Valve. The developers at Valve adored Peggle and started playing it constantly. One of PopCap's programmers who worked on the game, Eric Tam, had friends over at Valve, another Seattle-based company. So started getting reports from the people there being like, oh my God, this game of yours is so good and you have killed productivity at the company and Left 4 Dead is slipping because nobody is working on games and is playing Peggle. And could you please give us some pointers on how to beat some of the more advanced stages? They knew that the people at Valve adored the game. So kind of a little bit as a joke, they created a version of the game that had Valve iconography instead, like head crabs and stuff like that. Then they made a deal with Valve to put it in the orange box. So the classic orange box, one of the most amazing values ever released in the history of gaming, came with this special version of Peggle and blew the market wide open for the game. It just became absolutely huge. And they also got some extra promotion on a new little online service called Steam that Valve was just starting up. which also spurred further sales. So Peggle became their second, I mean, they had other games that were successful, but became their second truly massive hit after the Bejeweled franchise. And it was in large part because of Valve's promotion of the game through the Orange Box and through Steam. Here in 2007, PopCap is straddling both worlds. They've still got the popular Bejeweled franchise. They have other games that have been popular over time, like Bookworm and Zuma. They have a hit in the more hardcore space now as well with Peggle, which goes on to sell millions and tens of millions of copies. They're still at this time, though, totally based on a PC-first model. The games they're creating are for computer platforms. They do make deals, as we talked about, to do ports to cell phone platforms, pre-smartphone, Palm Pilots, and they get on things like Xbox Live Arcade and this, that, and the other thing. But they're really focused on their PC market, mostly contracting out for ports. However, as the market is starting to change, that starts to change a little bit at the company as well. In 2006, for the first time, they bring on a real businessman to serve as the CEO of the company, Dave Roberts. Roberts doesn't fundamentally change the company at all. He's not suddenly turning it into some kind of business-first venture when he joins the company. But he's definitely more focused on the business end and does a little bit more targeted work in some of these areas. One of the first things that he does when he first joins the company is he buys a studio in Dublin that is working on cell phone games, again, pre-smartphone. Both so that they have a European base of operations to distribute their games over there, and also so that they now have some internal ability to do cell phone games, and they're starting to take within themselves some of these other platforms. They also set up a group, I don't know if it happens when Roberts is there or just before he gets there because the timing's about the same. They also set up a group internally, an engineering group at the company, that is specifically focused on emerging platforms and seeing what new platforms are coming into the market and getting the company into those platforms. This group is led by a guy named Ed Allard, who joined the company in 2005 when PopCap bought his company, Sprout Games, which was another one of these online game companies. This wasn't so much an expansion opportunity as it was that they knew the people at Sprout and Sprout wasn't doing well. They basically bought them to help out their friends, and Ed Allard joined the company. Contrasted with when they bought the Dublin studio, which was a deliberate effort by Roberts to expand them into new markets. They now have a dedicated team internally. They're not just relying on external teams to make these connections on these new platforms. One company that Allard's group ends up making a deal with and working with is Apple to port their games to the iPod. That's right. I did not misspeak. The iPod.
Why would you put games on an iPod? That's for music.
Because it's there. So they created ports of Bejeweled and Peggle for the iPod, which was apparently an interesting experience because you can't do floating point in iPod programming. There is no floating point.
That could be a problem.
Yeah, especially with a heavily physics-based game like Peggle.
Bejeweled, you can get away with it. Peggle, with, I don't know, angles and arcs, might need a wee bit of, physical ability to have floating points.
Yeah, but they made it work somehow, and now they had a dedicated team to working on these Apple products. So because they were such good partners on that, Apple told them right at the beginning that, hey, we're launching this new phone that has a touchscreen, and we're going to have an app store. Since you've been such good partners with us on the iPod, we're going to let you be in our app store at launch. So they created a version of Bejeweled for the App Store right when it first launched in 2007, so they're on the iPhone right away. They're still primarily a PC company. They're still a PC-first kind of establishment, but that's going to change a little bit with the last of the big three games that we have to discuss here, which is the one you alluded to at the top of the episode, Plants vs. Zombies. We're not going to spend a lot of time covering this. We're running up against it, and there's not a lot to say. Plants vs. Zombies was a PC game at first, too, because PopCap is a PC-first company. But there's going to be a shift here. Plants vs. Zombies was the brainchild of a developer by the name of George Fan. George first worked with PopCap all the way back in the year 2001. When PopCap released a game of his, he didn't work for the company, he was independent, but released a game of his called Insane Aquarium. All one word, Insane Aquarium. This game was built as part of an independent game jam. He wanted to do a game to enter into competition at the Independent Games Festival. He wanted to create a game that started on its face to be a very simple game, but gets more and more complex the longer you play it. He was most likely inspired kind of by the virtual pet craze that was going on at the time to create a game around fish in an aquarium. At the start of the game, there would just be a couple of fish on the screen. You would have to click on them to feed them, and the idea as the game went on was to keep all the fish fed. But then, after playing another game that he has not revealed the name of, I don't know if he even remembers it anymore, so I don't know what the game was, but he played a Java game where you could earn currency by doing things in the game and then use that currency to create upgrades. Something very standard in all sorts of mobile games today, but more novel back in 2001. So he decided to build out this concept a little more so that when you clicked on the fish and fed them, you would get currency, and then you could use that currency to buy various upgrades. And he added things like hostile forces that are coming in and trying to attack your fish. So it became this management game where you're trying to keep the fish fed, you're earning currency to buy upgrades, to help defend your fish, and all of this kind of stuff. And so it's a game that starts really simple and has a really simple interface, but gets more complex as time goes on. Fan created a Insane Aquarium for this Independent Game Festival. Afterwards, he made a deal with PopCap to publish it. It did fine. You know, it wasn't one of their biggest hits or anything, but it did fine. They were kind of interested in working with him, but he didn't want to work with them. He actually ended up getting a job with Blizzard and worked for a time on Diablo 3 for a couple of years. Kind of got burnt out on that, went independent again, and then thought that the time might be right to make a sequel to Insane Aquarium. He was particularly struck by the DS at this time. This would be about 2004 or 2005. He thought it would be really cool to increase the complexity by using the two screens of the DS, and so you'd have two fish tanks. The bottom one would be your tank where you're primarily doing the feeding, and the top one would be your primary tank that you were upgrading into a fortress and defending your fish. So he kind of started on this new idea for Insane Aquarium 2 based on these parameters. At the same time, he had also really gotten into tower defense games, the genre that was primarily pioneered through mods in StarCraft and Warcraft 3, in which there are hordes of things that are attacking you, and you have to erect various defenses that block and kill these hordes coming at you. And decided that it would be cool to kind of put some tower defense elements into this Insane Aquarium 2 game. Then he decided that a nice solid thing within this kind of biological framework that he had for the towers would be plants, because plants are stationary objects, and you can do a wide variety of plants that look interesting. So he took it out of the water. Obviously, we're getting out of the aquarium now, and decided that you would build plants with your resources to repel these hordes, which at the time were bug-like aliens, but eventually morphed into zombies. He decided to keep it a pretty simple, kind of 5-lane game, but have complexity with different types of enemies and different types of plants that are needed to repel these different types of enemies. So you ended up with a game where you have to gather resources, the suns that appear on the screen periodically, so that you have the monies to buy the plants to put in the lanes of your playing field to repel the various zombie hordes. That, of course, became Plants vs. Zombies. At first, Plants vs. Zombies was released for their traditional platforms. It was a Windows game, a boxed game, I think. They certainly released it on Steam as well. But then they also converted it to the iOS environment. If there was ever a game that was just perfectly suited to touchscreen controls, it is Plants vs. Zombies.
You see, Alex, I have a Generation 1 iPad. Said Generation 1 iPad and I spent an entire weekend curled on the couch as I played, for the outrageous price of $10, Plants vs. Zombies.
Yeah.
So much tapping.
It is so intuitive as a touchscreen game and plays so well in that way that it was doing all right on PC platforms, but it made a killing on iOS and was especially considered a very good game to play with the recently released, as you said, iPad. The iPad has never really found itself place as a truly important gaming platform. But Plants vs. Zombies was kind of a killer app for that Generation 1 iPad because of how well it worked with it.
Even though my iPad is a glorified picture frame now, it still has hidden in its recesses Plants vs. Zombies.
Absolutely. So this was a real signal that the market was shifting. It was released in 2009, Plants vs. Zombies. And it was really the last time, I think, that the PC was going to be the really, really important lead platform. It was a huge hit, but it was primarily propelled to that stardom by smartphones and tablets rather than through the PC version. That takes us up to 2009, and by this time we're in a world that is very much changing. I mean, we already talked about how the world's changing with these smart devices, but that's not the only thing that's happening. Casual gaming is changing. The main driver of that change at this exact moment that we're talking about is the arrival in the mainstream of social gaming on Facebook, and particularly the Zynga game Farmville, which launched in 2009. I don't know how many of you were on Facebook back then. Facebook is in some ways an even more dystopian hellscape today with all of the unwanted content that gets forced into your feed by the analytics. Back then, it was a different kind of hellscape where you didn't get content from people who weren't your friends, but instead you got requests from your friends for help in Farmville and Cityville and Mafia Wars and everything else to build this and acquire that, whether you played the stupid game or not.
At the time we hated it. Now we kind of miss it.
Yeah, and eventually Facebook changed it so that couldn't happen anymore, which is what kind of killed this social gaming wave. Social gaming on Facebook, which was more focused around time sinks and microtransactions, this new model that was coming in to being here, was fundamentally altering the casual game space, and the PopCap people did not like it. They were very dismissive of Facebook. They were very dismissive of Farmville. They did not get on Facebook right away. They didn't understand why anyone would pay money for a virtual cow. They did not like the microtransaction model. That was a miss for them because Facebook gaming blew up, and they did eventually get on it. They released a version of Bejeweled on there, Bejeweled Blitz. I think they even did their own Farmville-ish kind of clone at one point. It was clear the market was shifting, and the market was changing, and not everyone was on board with the form that this was taking. With the microtransactions, with the locking you out through timers and paying to accelerate timers and all of that. That had never been part of PopCap's model. That had never been what they were about. They were about making slick, entertaining games that they sold for a reasonable price, one and done, for people to play. That's what they'd been doing from Bejeweled all the way through Plants vs. Zombies. There was a sense amongst the founders that the market was getting riskier, the markets were shifting, the markets were going places they didn't necessarily approve of. They'd had to make a lot of bets over the years, and they'd come out all right, but it's always scary every time you have to bet, and they figured that they were going to have to bet more and more on the ever-changing media landscape. So at this point, they really had only two options in their mind, which was go public, so they have lots of money and investors, or be acquired by another company. Long story short, they ultimately decided to be acquired by another company. There were several companies in the running. Zynga was one of them. But they ultimately went with Electronic Arts. Electronic Arts had a reputation in the previous decade for buying other publishers and then gutting them. Some of that reputation, in my opinion, is a little unfair, but it's certainly a thing that happened, whether it was deliberate on EA's part or not. EA was under different management by this time. John Riccitiello, who was trying to empower creators. That didn't always work either. That's a whole nother episode. But it was a time when EA was valuing the input of founders and creators. They felt that EA was really interested in them and their studio and wanted to keep them and their creativity intact. And EA had been around, unlike, say, Zynga, had been around for several decades, had weathered peaks and valleys in the video game industry before, and they felt pretty certain would continue to weather those peaks and valleys in the future, thus providing them a sense of security. They ultimately did decide in 2011 to sell out to Electronic Arts for $650 million with an additional $100 million in stock options. It really marked the end of the company that we've been talking about in the company as we know it. PopCap still exists today. They dropped the games at some point. They're just PopCap. They're still there. They still make casual games for Electronic Arts. But they very much, as the entire industry did in that time period, embraced the whole free-to-play model with microtransactions. It's not something that the founders ever really wanted to do. They kind of one by one left the company over the next couple of years. They still exist, but they're a very different company now. They still maintain a lot of those hit series. They're still making games, but it's more just the free-to-play and mobile arm of Electronic Arts business. They're not any longer this company that was driven by its founders to make really slick products that fly in the face of what people considered games and are still entertaining and worth your time, even if some of them are just simple time wasters. 2011 is the end of the independent company, and really that's the end of the story we want to tell here as well about PopCap Games.
Still a legacy of games that are quite enjoyable, and you can still play them to this day. I will, of course, have links in the show notes to as much as I can pull together. So, Alex, since we seem to have finally defeated all of these zombies, all my pegs are gone, and we spent all of our jewels in order to plant the garden again, what will we discuss in our next episode?
Other than occasional random references like PopCap Dublin aside, we really haven't spent much time across the pond recently, discussing developments in the good old United Kingdom and in Europe. One of the really significant companies there that we haven't really touched on yet is the company US Gold, founded by Jeff Brown in 1984.
I know US Gold has come up a few times.
Oh, sure. They were a very important company at a time when the entire British industry was embracing a budget model and going for cheaper and cheaper product. Jeff Brown had the foresight to look across at what was going on in the United States on the Commodore 64 and start importing some of that product into the United Kingdom, which really kind of advanced the whole state of the British industry and made US Gold one of the absolute major players in the British and European software industries until they were folded into what became the IDOS group, which we did discuss in our IDOS episode. Yeah, very important British company. Haven't checked in across the pond for a while, so this seems like a good place to go next.
All right, I guess we're just going to have to go digging for some gold. Next time on They Create Worlds. Check out our show notes at podcast.theycreateworlds.com, where we have links to some of the things that we discussed in this and other episodes. You can check out Alex's video game history blog at videogamehistorian.wordpress.com. Alex's book, They Create Worlds, the story of the people and companies that shaped the video game industry, Volume 1, can now be ordered through CRC Press and at major online retailers. Feel free to email us at feedback@theycreateworlds.com. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/theycreateworlds. If you do sign up, please do so through the website and not through the iOS app. This saves you from the 30% Apple markup. We understand that you may not be able to financially support us, but you can still support us by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or the podcasting service that you use. We now have the podcast available on YouTube. Please like and subscribe. Intro music is Airplane Mode by Josh Woodward, found at joshwoodward.com/song/airplane mode, used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. Outro music is Bacterial Love by Roll Music, found at freemusicarchive.org, used under a Creative Commons Attribution license.